My name is Erin Walker. I'm 28 years old, and for the first time in my life, I'm living in a place where no one knows my family exists. I moved to Oregon 6 months ago, unpacked my life into a quiet apartment, started a new job, and waited to see how long it would take before anyone in my family noticed I was gone. They didn't. Not a call. Not a question. Not even a casual, "Where are you these days?" And then, out of nowhere, my father's name lit up my phone last week. I remember staring at the screen, wondering if he meant to call me or if it was a mistake. But it wasn't. He jumped straight to the point, exactly like the title of this story says. He was demanding I come home for my sister's wedding so we could look like a perfect family. No greeting, no explanation for the sudden interest, just an order. He didn't know what state I lived in. He didn't know I had moved. He didn't know anything. And somehow he still expected me to drop my entire life and show up smiling beside the people who had forgotten I existed. I refused. He didn't like that. The conversation escalated fast, fast enough that I had to put the phone down and take a breath afterward. I can still hear the way his voice shifted when I told him no. I can still feel the moment everything in me snapped, and I realized I wasn't going to play the role they assigned me anymore. But the real shock came after I walked away from that call, because what he said next changed everything, and what I did afterward changed even more. CTA. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. Respect didn't mean much in my house. What mattered was who could hold my parents' attention the longest. It was obvious early on that I was not the main event. My name is Erin Walker, and I am the younger of two daughters. My older sister, Courtney Walker, fit perfectly into the picture my parents, Michael and Patricia Walker, wanted to project. She loved stages, uniforms, spotlights, anything that came with applause. My parents organized their weeks around her games and ceremonies like they were national holidays. I was the quiet one. I preferred books to bullhorns, sketches to spotlights. I liked instructions, problems, blank pages that needed ideas. Teachers called me independent and self-motivated, which sounded like compliments until I realized they also meant the kid no one has to worry about. At home, that label gave my parents permission to forget I might need attention too. The difference really showed up in small, ordinary moments. If Courtney had a game, everyone stopped what they were doing. Carpools were arranged, coolers were packed, evenings were devoted to cheering from metal bleachers. When I brought home a perfect score or a certificate from some academic thing, it got a quick smile and maybe a magnet on the side of the fridge, squeezed between appointment reminders and grocery lists. In middle school, I spent a lot of weekends at the kitchen table with textbooks, while the rest of the house rotated around whatever Courtney had going on. I would look up from an essay and hear my parents talking about her coaches and her future, like she was a project they were all building together. No one ever sat down with a calendar and a highlighter for me. By high school, the gap between us had turned into a routine no one questioned. For her 17th birthday, Courtney got a used sedan so she could get herself to practice and volunteer work. My father spent an entire Saturday in the driveway teaching her how to back into tight parking spots, patient and proud. I watched from the front window between chapters of a physics assignment, knowing there was no version of that scene with me in it. I kept pushing myself because school felt like the only place where effort reliably turned into results. I signed up for advanced classes, stayed late for extra projects, said yes to anything that might help on a college application. Awards and honor roll lists started to pile up. Most nights it was just me and a plastic chair in a multi-purpose room, listening for my name in a line of others and pretending it didn't sting that no one was there to clap. The only person who seemed to notice what I was building was my grandfather, Frank Miller. He had retired from factory work by then and lived about an hour away, but whenever he visited, he would ask what I was reading and what I was making. He was the first person in my life to sit down with me at the dining room table and really look at something I had created. One afternoon, I showed him a set of wireframes I had drawn for a class assignment, screens for a pretend app that helped people track their medication. He studied every page, asked why buttons were in certain places, made me walk him through how someone would use it. "You know people get paid to do this, right?" he said eventually, tapping the corner of one drawing. "To make things less confusing, to make systems make sense." No one else had ever put it that way. In my parents' minds, the respectable paths were things they recognized: nursing, teaching, something steady and familiar, like what Courtney wanted. My grandfather was the one who quietly widened the map. Thanks to him, the idea that I could turn design and technology into a real career stopped feeling like a daydream and started feeling like a plan. By the time senior year rolled around, that plan was the only part of my future that felt solid. The other piece, the part about how any of it was going to be paid for, was a question hanging over every conversation about college, and I could already tell I was the only one losing sleep over it. Stepping into college felt like entering a world that finally ran on rules I understood. Effort turned into progress, not into comparisons I could never win. I arrived on campus with 2 suitcases, a scholarship packet, and the quiet certainty that no one was coming to check whether I settled in. That absence didn't crush me the way people expect. If anything, it cleared the air. I no longer had to perform for people who weren't watching. My freshman year was a blur of long nights, cheap coffee, and the strange freedom of being surrounded by thousands of strangers who had no idea who I was supposed to be. I learned to navigate crowded hallways, lecture halls, and dining halls with the ease of someone who knew how to disappear. Between shifts at the campus computer lab and stacks of assignments, I kept building the skills that felt like pieces of a future that actually belonged to me. Each project pulled me deeper into the world of design, interface flows, usability tests, and the thrill of solving problems so people wouldn't have to struggle with them. During holiday breaks, most students dragged suitcases toward the bus station or airport. I stayed in the dorm when I could, claiming a quiet lounge and the soft hum of vending machines as my companions. The few times I visited home, I felt like a temporary guest in the narrative my parents were proudly crafting. They talked about my sister, Courtney Walker, with the enthusiasm of a publicist promoting a rising star. Her clinical rotations, her supervisors, her achievements, everything framed as steps on a path they approved of before she even took them. I was polite, listened, and slipped back to school without leaving a noticeable gap behind. After graduation, I accepted a junior UX designer position at a small technology company in Ohio. The salary was modest, but the work mattered to me. I rented a small studio with drafty windows, learned how to stretch groceries into meals, and saved every dollar I could. I liked my independence more than I expected. No one asked where I was going, what time I'd be home, or why I chose a job my parents didn't fully understand. They texted on birthdays, forwarded holiday photos, and occasionally mentioned Courtney's boyfriend, Tyler, who had quickly become their newest point of pride. I wasn't jealous. I was simply separate, and being separate let me grow. 2 years into that job, I reached a point where my portfolio felt solid enough for something bigger. I didn't know what bigger would look like until a recruiter emailed me about a health tech company expanding its design team. They were based in Colorado but fully open to remote work. The role combined everything I cared about: research, accessibility, long-term product strategy, and came with a salary number I had never seen attached to my name before. The interview process moved quickly. For the first time, professionals asked me detailed questions about my thought process, not just my deliverables. They treated me like someone whose perspective mattered. When the offer arrived, I reread it 3 times to be sure it was real. Accepting meant choosing my next home. Colorado was an option, but something in me wanted a clean break from every highway and grocery store aisle tied to old memories. Oregon had always hung at the back of my mind, a place with a mix of coastlines, forests, and creative pockets that felt right for someone building a life from scratch. I opened a search tab, typed Portland apartments, and let the idea settle. It fit. I didn't announce the decision. I packed my studio in quiet increments after work, listed the furniture I didn't need, and started mailing paperwork across time zones. When I told my grandfather, Frank Miller, he sounded proud in a way I could feel through the phone. His belief in me had always been steady, never conditional, and that consistency mattered more than he probably realized. When moving day came, I locked the studio door behind me without ceremony. No one stood in the doorway hugging me goodbye or asking when I'd visit. I slid the keys into an envelope for the landlord, zipped my backpack, and boarded a flight west with the same calm determination that had carried me through every stage of growing up. Portland greeted me with a sense of possibility more than anything else. I signed a lease, arranged my desk near a window, and started my new job with the feeling that I had finally stepped into the version of myself I'd been trying to reach for years. I didn't know then how long it would take before anyone noticed I was gone, or how dramatically their sudden attention would unravel old expectations. All I knew was that Oregon felt like the beginning of something I chose on my own terms. By the time 6 months passed, Oregon felt less like an experiment and more like a life I finally fit into. My days settled into a rhythm I had only watched other people have: coffee in the morning, product meetings with my new team, long stretches of quiet focus where my work actually influenced decisions. For once, I wasn't the background character in a story someone else was telling. I felt present in my own. I didn't track the time since my family last reached out. The silence was familiar. I worked, I hiked, I built habits that had nothing to do with proving anything to anyone. If someone had asked me then whether my parents knew where I lived, I would have answered honestly, they never asked, and I never offered. It wasn't rebellion. It was simply the truth. One evening, after finishing a design review, I placed my phone on the counter while heating leftovers. When it buzzed, I expected a notification from a coworker or maybe my grandfather checking in. Instead, the screen displayed Dad. The name looked strange, like it belonged to a phone I no longer owned. I let it ring once, twice. Curiosity won. The moment I answered, my father's voice came through with the same clipped urgency he used when dealing with tasks he considered beneath him. There was no, "How are you?" or "What's new with you?" His first words formed a demand, not a request, not an invitation. He said I needed to come home next weekend. A dinner had been planned. People were expecting me. My absence would send the wrong message. There was no explanation beyond that. He spoke as if I'd been living across town and had simply forgotten an appointment. His tone carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed without question. I kept my voice steady while my mind tried to process the sudden pressure. The dinner, I realized, wasn't really about me. It was for my sister, Courtney Walker, and the family she was marrying into. I had heard her fiancé's last name, Brooks, once or twice in passing years ago, but that was the extent of my involvement. Apparently, the Brooks family wanted to meet their future in-laws, which meant my parents needed every piece of the puzzle arranged neatly. I understood then. They didn't need me. They needed the image of me. Refusing felt almost instinctive. I didn't justify it, didn't soften it. I simply said I wouldn't be there. My father did not take that well. The shift in his voice was immediate, like a door slamming shut. He jumped from irritation to indignation, peppering his words with the kind of disappointment he used on people who didn't behave according to his expectations. He listed reasons attendance was necessary, none of which involved me as a person, only as a prop. His disbelief grew when I told him I wasn't in Ohio. Confusion flickered first, then disbelief, then anger thick enough to feel through the speaker. He demanded an explanation as though my location required his approval. He asked when I planned to move back, implying that my presence at this dinner should outweigh whatever life I had elsewhere. The truth didn't soften him. When I finally said I had moved to Oregon months earlier, a long silence filled the line. It was the kind of pause that exposes everything someone didn't bother to pay attention to. He asked why I hadn't told him. The question sounded performative, not wounded. I recognized the tone from childhood. He wasn't looking for understanding. He was asserting control. I didn't give him the answer he wanted. I didn't cushion the reality. I only acknowledged the simple fact. No one had asked where I lived for a very long time. From there, the call turned into something sharp and exhausting. He insisted parents had the right to know where their children were. He said family obligations mattered. He said my absence reflected poorly on all of them. Each statement revealed exactly who this was really about. I stayed calm even as my pulse climbed. The distance between us felt wider than any state line. Nothing he said sounded like someone wanting a daughter present. Everything sounded like someone who feared losing the illusion of unity he had sold to strangers. When the call ended, it wasn't with understanding or compromise. It ended because I refused to bend. I set my phone down and let the weight of the moment settle. The realization that for the first time, my father needed something from me, and I didn't feel obligated to deliver it. That was the night I understood Oregon hadn't just given me a new life. It had given me the space to choose which parts of the old one I would no longer participate in. A few days after that call, life in Oregon continued as if nothing had happened, but the tension lingered at the edge of my thoughts. I kept working, sketching wireframes, reviewing features, answering Slack messages, and trying not to anticipate the next interruption. I didn't have to wait long. Early one morning, barely past sunrise, my phone vibrated with a familiar name. It was my father again. I didn't want to answer, but letting it ring felt like leaving a door unlocked. I picked up. His voice carried a stiffness I recognized from moments when he felt cornered. There was no attempt at small talk, no pretense of concern. He went straight to instructions, spoken with a force that suggested he'd rehearsed them. He said the dinner I refused had created unnecessary complications. He said my absence had made the Brooks family ask questions they shouldn't be asking. He said I was expected at the wedding, regardless of distance, schedule, or preference. The tone wasn't disappointment, it was inconvenience. I realized then that in his mind, I wasn't a daughter. I was a missing piece in a presentation he wanted to keep polished. When I didn't commit, his words hardened. He said attendance wasn't optional. He said the reputation of the entire household depended on it. He said the Brooks family took family structure seriously, and that my refusal reflected poorly on everyone involved. He framed each reason as if it were a moral obligation, but none had anything to do with me as a person. I felt it in the way he listed them, like bullet points on a list of tasks he expected me to accomplish. Then he took a breath, and everything shifted. He said if I didn't show up for the wedding, he would remove me from his will, completely, permanently, no hesitation, no softness. He delivered the threat like it was a tool he'd reached for before, as if withholding something were the natural way to regain control. I didn't panic. I didn't plead. I didn't even feel angry. What I felt instead was a clarity so sharp it almost steadied me. For years I had lived with the quiet understanding that I simply wasn't part of the circle he valued. Hearing him use inheritance as leverage didn't shock me, it confirmed what I already knew. I responded calmly because fury wasn't required. I told him about my job, not in detail, just enough for him to understand the scale. I told him my salary was higher than what he, my mother, and Courtney Walker earned combined. I didn't raise my voice or rush my words. I simply stated a fact he had never bothered to ask about. There was a silence that felt heavier than anything he had said. It was the silence of someone encountering a reality they were unprepared to process. For the first time, he didn't sound in control. When he finally spoke, his tone had transformed. He tried to redraw the scene, tried to sound warm, proud, almost sentimental. He said he had always believed in me. He said the wedding mattered because family moments shouldn't be missed. He said he wanted the Brooks family to see us as united. He layered these lines with the softness he usually reserved for outsiders, not for his own children. It was astonishing how quickly affection appeared when he thought I had something worth claiming. His shift didn't move me. If anything, it made the boundary inside me solidify further. I wasn't offended. I was simply done participating in a role that only seemed to matter when it could benefit someone else. I didn't owe him explanations, emotional labor, or performances he hadn't earned. When he asked again, carefully this time, whether I would come home, I told him no. The word came easily. It didn't shake or falter. It felt like choosing my own life over the one I had outgrown. He tried to continue the conversation, but there was nothing left to discuss. I let him speak until the weight of his insistence grew monotonous. Then I ended the call. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just a clear, final decision. After the screen went dark, I opened my settings and blocked his number. Then I blocked my mother's and my sister's. The action took seconds, but the relief was immediate. The silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt earned. I went back to my desk, opened my laptop, and returned to my work. For the first time in a long while, my life felt uninterrupted, and I wasn't interested in allowing anyone to fracture that peace again. The weekend of the wedding arrived quietly for me, marked only by a reminder on my calendar that I deleted without hesitation. While my family prepared for photographs and speeches in Ohio, I focused on something entirely different, a house tour I had scheduled an hour outside Portland. It felt symbolic in a way I didn't need to analyze. One family was trying to complete a picture I no longer belonged to. I was creating one of my own. The house was a small craftsman with a sloped roof, shaded by two old maple trees. I walked through the rooms with the agent trailing a few steps behind, taking notes as she spoke about square footage and recent updates. I imagined where I would put my desk, where I'd store my hiking gear, how the light would fall in the afternoons. It was the first place I had seen that made me picture permanence rather than the next step on a ladder. After the tour, I returned to my apartment, made a late lunch, and opened my laptop to review documentation for an upcoming product sprint. The day felt strangely calm, almost suspended, as if the usual noise of life had paused for a moment. I didn't think about Ohio. I didn't think about the vows being exchanged or the group photos that would be posted online. My world existed solely within the walls I had chosen. That calm lasted until Sunday afternoon, when my phone lit up with my grandfather's name, Grandpa. His calls had a way of grounding me, and I answered immediately. His tone was steady, but there was a weight behind it that told me he wasn't calling just to chat. He said the wedding had been memorable, though not for reasons anyone hoped. I could hear him choosing his words carefully, as if sorting through what to share and what to shield me from. He started with the rehearsal dinner. The Brooks family had arrived polished and composed, the kind of people who noticed everything without appearing to. They asked about traditions, histories, and connections. At some point, someone mentioned siblings, and the absence of my name in the conversation struck them as odd. My parents attempted to redirect, but subtle discomfort had already begun to settle around the table. During the slideshow portion of the evening, an arrangement of childhood photos set to soft music, the issue deepened. My grandfather described the moment plainly, picture after picture of Courtney Walker, milestones, celebrations, school events, all presented as the linear path of a cherished daughter. My face never appeared. Not once. It wasn't a surprise to me, but apparently it was to the Brooks family. According to my grandfather, their expressions shifted. They whispered among themselves. When the slideshow ended, they asked why there were no photos of me. My parents responded with excuses, technical errors, missing files, timing issues. None of it made sense, and the Brooks family knew it. By the wedding day, the tension had grown. My grandfather said that Rebecca Brooks, the mother of the groom, spoke privately with my parents before the ceremony. She had done her own quiet research. She had learned I lived out of state. She had learned that I wasn't invited to engagement events. She had learned enough to piece together the truth without anyone spelling it out. The Brooks were not angry, he said, but they were disappointed, deeply and visibly. They told my parents that commitment to family was a value they took seriously, and that patterns of exclusion could have long-term consequences for any relationship connected to theirs. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't create a scene. They simply made it clear that they expected better from the people marrying into their family. My grandfather said the ceremony went on, but the atmosphere had shifted. Smiles looked rehearsed. Toasts felt overly polished. My sister, Courtney Walker, appeared unsettled, glancing at her in-laws with uncertainty she couldn't hide. Even in photos, he said, something looked off, like a painting with mismatched colors beneath the varnish. The aftermath came quickly. The Brooks family withdrew an offer they had previously made, a contribution meant to help the newlyweds with long-term stability. No argument, no negotiation, just a firm, polite reversal. They did not trust the framework they were aligning their son with. They wanted the marriage to succeed, but not at the cost of enabling dysfunction. My grandfather paused before telling me this, as if to soften the impact. But I didn't feel satisfaction or vindication. If anything, I felt a distant heaviness, like watching a storm roll over a town I once lived in but no longer belonged to. He continued only long enough to explain that my parents spent the evening circling explanations, trying to regain footing they had lost long before the wedding ever began. The consequences weren't theatrical, they were practical and immediate, the kind that reshaped dynamics for years. When the call ended, I sat in my quiet apartment, feeling neither triumph nor regret. The wedding had unfolded exactly the way a structure built on neglect eventually does, under its own weight, without my involvement. A few months passed, and life settled into a rhythm that felt steady in a way I hadn't experienced before. My days revolved around work, long walks, and the quiet routines I had built for myself. Nothing dramatic happened, and maybe that was the point. Peace had finally replaced the noise I had grown up with. One afternoon, while reviewing design proposals at my dining table, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I ignored it at first, assuming it was a local contractor or a sales call. But then another message came through from a different number, followed by several more in quick succession. They were short, clipped, and unmistakably from my mother and sister, even though the numbers were new. Each message tried to reach past the boundary I had set, but I didn't open them. I simply deleted them without reading further. Later that week, a letter arrived at my doorstep with my father's handwriting on the envelope. I didn't hesitate. I dropped it straight into the trash and went on with my day. I didn't feel anger or vindication, only clarity. I had no interest in sorting through explanations written too late to matter. During that same period, my own world expanded in small but meaningful ways. I closed on the house I had toured, moved in with help from a few coworkers, and started planting herbs in the backyard. I set up a home office with enough space to breathe, not just work. I hosted 2 colleagues for dinner one night, listening to them talk about their families, their ambitions, their frustrations. It struck me how ordinary their family dynamics sounded, supportive, flawed, but grounded in care rather than competition. Not once did I feel a pull to compare their experiences to mine. The distance between my past and my present felt like a quiet line drawn across a map, impossible to erase and unnecessary to revisit. My grandfather called periodically, always checking in, always respecting the boundaries I needed. On one call, he mentioned that things back in Ohio had grown tense. The newlyweds were struggling with trust issues, strained by questions from the Brooks family about long-term expectations. My parents were still trying to regain footing, but the Brooks remained distant and skeptical. He said the shift felt permanent, the kind of change that doesn't announce itself loudly but settles into the foundation over time. I listened, not out of curiosity about their troubles, but out of respect for him. When he finished, I told him I was doing well, genuinely well. He said he could hear that in my voice, and for a moment I felt the ease of a connection built on something real. The seasons continued to change. Winter softened into spring, and I grew accustomed to the simple comfort of my home. I bought a used SUV for hiking trips. I adopted a rescue dog, a quiet, gentle mixed breed who never barked unless absolutely necessary. On weekends, I drove into the mountains, letting the cold air wash over me while the dog trotted ahead on the trail. No one from my former home knew where I'd gone, and that anonymity felt more like freedom than distance. Every so often, I would think about the wedding. Not the events, but the idea of a structure collapsing simply because the truth had nowhere else to go. There was no satisfaction in knowing what had happened, only a recognition that the consequences my family faced were the natural outcome of years they had chosen not to change. The truth is, leaving wasn't an act of revenge, it was an act of survival. And survival, when done right, eventually becomes growth. Now, when people ask if I have siblings, I say no. Not because I'm hiding something, but because the role never existed to begin with. When they ask about my parents, I say we're not in contact, and most people don't press further. The ones who do listen long enough understand that some stories aren't broken, they're simply closed. If anyone takes anything from what I've lived through, I hope it's this. Sometimes the family you're born into is not the family that shapes you. Sometimes the only way to break a cycle is to walk away from it completely. And sometimes the most radical form of self-respect is choosing peace over permission. I built a life that finally feels like mine, not borrowed, not bargained for, not performed. Just mine. And if you've stayed with me until now, thank you for listening. If you've ever had to choose yourself over the expectations of others, I hope my story reminds you that you're allowed to. I appreciate you spending your time with me today.